Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale says 60 ISIS fighters have returned to Canada. That ain't good news. To tell us a little bit more about it is our Ottawa contributor, Brian Lilley. Brian, the feds are saying they want to rehabilitate. Can you even rehabilitate terrorists? How does that work?
Well, I'm not surprised by the number 60. That's floated around before through various reports, but all of this came up again because of an interview that a British cabinet minister, Minister for International Development over in the UK, gave to the BBC. And he was asked, well, what do we do with these returning ISIS fighters? And he said, well, I think all we can do is kill them. And people were shocked. Well, that caused journalists in Canada to call Ralph Goodale's office and said, we've got ISIS fighters coming back. What are we doing with them? And they talked about doing rehabilitation and reintegration support services. Well, for an awful lot of Canadians, I'm sure there's somewhere between kill them and let's give them rehabilitation support services. So the Liberals have been facing an awful lot of questions about this. All week they've been quizzed on it by Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives, who want to know, okay, what are you doing? What exactly are you doing? And all they'll do is fall back and saying that while they support our intelligence and our security services and we trust the RCMP, Michelle Rempel even asking, okay, but how many of these guys that have come back are under surveillance? Ralph Goodale's response is, we can't tell you. You wouldn't want us giving out operational security details on the floor of the House of Commons. And Rempel's response to Goodale was, the only acceptable answer should be all of them. And he didn't do that. So this is going to be a bit of a sticky situation for the Liberals, I think, because we've already had the agreement with Omar Khadr and with others. We've got the man that's suing the government for $50 million, saying his rights were violated, even though he was never a Canadian. There could be a building narrative, if this continues, that these guys actually are soft on terror. Now, you could point to certain examples that would support that and others that would not support that. But if they keep having issues like these settlement deals and we're doing rehabilitation support for terrorists, that will build a narrative that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals don't want going forward.
Well, how about the bare minimum, even just take away their Canadian citizenship instead of dual citizenship? Why not that? Has that been discussed?
Yes, in the case that Justin Trudeau says that's not what he wants to do. Look, there have been people that have gone to join ISIS that only have Canadian citizenship. And so in those cases, you can't do anything about it. But I remember being at the Monk debates during the 2015 election, and Justin Trudeau had made a big deal saying he would get rid of the Conservatives' bill that said if you were a dual national and took up arms against Canada, we'd take away your Canadian citizenship and you could go back to wherever you came from. Justin Trudeau said, we can't do that. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And I quizzed him because his own father had stripped Canadian citizenship from Nazi war criminals. The government at the time was in the middle of doing the same thing for, at this point, 90-year-old Nazi war criminals. And I said, well, why can you do it in these cases, but not in the others? And they said, well, they lied on their application when they came to Canada. And I thought, what? Lying on your application? This is not to diminish anything that Nazi camp guards did, but his answer was they lied on their application when they came to Canada. Well, I think taking up arms against Canada is even worse than lying on your application. But Justin Trudeau doesn't see things that way. So that is basically a non-starter for this government. So that's not going to happen. I'm not sure the Conservatives want to bring that up again because the media is almost to a man and woman against it.
Now let's switch gears for just a moment. 15,000 people on the deportation list. Some countries won't take back their people, but Canadian Border Services Agency, and they won't say which countries. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of these people could be terrorists. They could be war criminals. This has happened before. I remember Vic Taves, when he was the Conservative public safety minister, made an announcement saying we've got, it was over 100 people. I can't remember the exact number, but more than 100 war criminals and terrorists that are in Canada that we want to deport. And people said, oh, okay, hello, who? Can you tell us who they are? Because they couldn't find them. And they said, oh, no, we can't tell you that because it would violate their privacy rights. And the public outcry was, To heck with their privacy rights. They're not Canadians. They're war criminals. They're terrorists. We want them deported. Tell us who they are. Well, eventually they released the most wanted list, and a bunch of people got deported. This kind of reminds me of that. We've got the Canadian Border Services Agency saying, we've got people that we want to deport, but the countries they're from won't take them back. Okay, which countries? We can't tell you which countries. That wouldn't be right. Well, I'm sorry. I think now's the time that you name them, you shame them, you go on Twitter, you call them out, you do whatever you can. The United States, Hal, actually publishes an annual report on this very issue. It's not unique to Canada that this happens. And the U.S. says, groups like Sudan and Eritrea and various countries are non-cooperative. They are recalcitrant countries. And if they do not accept their own people back that come to the United States illegally or should be deported, then those countries face sanctions. It could be visa restrictions. It could be other types of problems. Guess what? That makes them kind of comply with your wish to send Johnny Hoodlum back to their country.
Now, Finance Minister Bill Morneau, speaking of Johnny Hood, no, I shouldn't. It's a bad
Oh,
Now, he continues to be the center of a little bit of controversy as the House returned MPs, both parties, blasting him and talking about, what the Ethics Commissioner had to say. How did it go anyway with Mr. Morneau?
yeah, I think Bill Morneau might want to put on a mask and hide out like he is a hoodlum at this point, because he can't escape the controversy around this. He's tried. He has done an awful lot to try and get away from it. He keeps saying, well, I followed the Ethics Commissioner's rules. But just this week, it has emerged as the House of Commons comes back that when it comes to the pension reform bill that he introduced, he didn't consult the Ethics Commissioner. Now, okay, we're getting boring here. What are Hal and Brian talking about? Well, Bill Morneau owned and ran a pension company, and he introduced a bill as finance minister to regulate the pension industry and bring in a new form of pension, Hal, that, guess what? Only a handful of companies actually offer these types of products, and it would make it easier to convert other pensions to that type of product, a targeted pension plan. One of them is Morneau Chappelle, the company that he owned millions, tens of millions of dollars worth of shares in. And so he keeps saying, well, I complied with the Ethics Commissioner and I had an ethics screen. He hadn't sold his shares. He still owned them. Okay, well, why are you introducing a bill that's going to benefit the company that you own? He won't answer that, just keep saying he's working hard for Canadians. The Prime Minister says, well, we followed the Ethics Commissioner's advice. Why are you attacking the Ethics Commissioner? Well, the Ethics Commissioner is actually investigating Bill Morneau for the second time. She's already fined him once for failing to report that he held a French villa in a numbered French company. Why? To lower his tax exposure if and when he passes it on. So, all those family farmers across the country that were told they were tax cheats for trying to make it easier to pass on the family farm to their kids, he wants to pass on his French villa to his kids. And so he set up this corporation to hold the French villa. Well, now he's under investigation for failing to talk to the Ethics Commissioner, failing to clear it with her to introduce Bill C-27, which would radically alter the pension landscape in Canada in a way that Morneau Chappelle, his former company, had been advocating for years. They're one of a handful of companies that would benefit. It all stinks to high heaven.
I've never seen a finance minister under such intense heat. It's just incredible here.
I think we'd have to go back to Michael Wilson for this sort of back to the Mulrooney days.
Right, that's true, yeah. Now, the opposition wants to know how Trudeau can declare his buddy Stephen Bronfman clear after his name showed up in the Paradise Papers, and the CRA is now investigating as well. Tell me a bit about that.
This is another example of a government that wants to be seen as the champion of the middle class, champion of the working guy, and they've got money problems with really wealthy folks. So Stephen Bronfman, as we've discussed before, you might, if you don't know the Bronfman name, and they haven't been in the media quite as much these last 20 years, but maybe you remember Seagram's. They used to own Seagram's. They used to own Universal Studios. The Hollywood studio, all the amusement parks, the Universal Music Group, they owned all of that. Stephen Bronfman is one of the heirs to that family fortune. Might be diminished from the heydays, but he's one of the heirs. Shows up in the Paradise Papers according to reports from the Toronto Star and CBC, using offshore trust and accounts to potentially be avoiding taxes. So CRA hears about this. They say, well, we'd like to look into this. We'd like to investigate. The Prime Minister says, well, I've talked to my friend Stephen Bronfman, who's also the Liberal Party chief fundraiser, and he tells me everything's fine. So he actually said, Trudeau said, we're satisfied. Who are you speaking for? And that's a question that Andrew Scheer keeps asking. Who are you speaking for? Are you speaking for the Liberal Party? Are you speaking for the government of Canada? Are you using royal pronouns like you're the Queen now suddenly? Because if he's speaking for the government of Canada, then that's problematic because CRA has a duty to investigate. And the Prime Minister jumped out in front of that investigation. I think they hoped that this would go away over the break week that they had. They all took off around November 10th, go back to their constituencies for Remembrance Day. They had a week back in the ridings. Now they're back. I think they hoped that this and the Morneau thing would go away, and instead they keep coming back. It continues to haunt them.
Now, speaking of the Canada Revenue Agency, Auditor General report says that when they called the CRA to spot check what advice CRA is simply giving to Canadians, 30% of the advice was wrong?
Yeah, so, hey, maybe Stephen Bronfman called CRA. Maybe he called them up and said, hey, I want to do this. I want to do this offshore thing. And he got bad advice. But yeah, the Auditor General's report's out. There are so many problems that we couldn't actually talk about them all today. But on this CRA one, this is one that all of us can relate to because sometimes you're doing your taxes and something doesn't seem right. Well, what do you do, Hal? You call CRA, you call their helpline, and there's two problems. One, it takes a long time to get to speak to somebody. Well, CRA says, oh no, we answer our calls within 2 minutes. That's true, they do. But the only way that they do that is that once it starts to get to 2 minutes and 1 second, 2 minutes and 2 seconds for calls to be answered, they block all the lines so you can't even get on hold anymore. And you just get told you can't get through. Now, if you do get through, there's a 3 in 10 chance that the information they give you will be incorrect. It seems unfathomable, but I actually had this, not with Canada Revenue Agency, but with Quebec's Revenue Agency. 2000, 2001, when I moved down there, was doing my first year of taxes. It was a split between Ontario and Quebec. I didn't know what to do. So I called them. I took copious notes. I did exactly what they said. Then I went down to an office, said, here's my forms, here's what I'm doing. They said, yeah, that's right. That's exactly what you should do. Filed my taxes, got a big refund. 2 years later, I'm back in Ontario and I get a call saying, you owe us thousands of dollars.
Wow. And you paid it all back, right? You paid it all back with interest? No.
I never went back to Quebec. I stayed in Ontario. Look, this can have real world implications for people. You know, often when we're talking politics, is there a relation to our daily life? Sometimes it can be tough to make that connection. On this one, we can all relate to, I called the tax man. The tax man told me what to do. Right. Now I'm getting audited. So, you know, this is a real problem that the Auditor General has uncovered.
Well, we only have a few moments left here, but I want to talk a little bit about NAFTA. Wrapping up in Mexico, moves to Montreal next. Now, a proposal from the American team is angering Mexico and could even bother some big American businesses. Tell me a bit about that.
Oh, yeah. So this is all about, you know how you can't call sparkling wine champagne unless it's from the Champagne region of France. So, you know, in Ontario, we make some great bubbly, right? But it's got to be called sparkling wine. Well, that's because Champagne is a designated region. Well, the Mexicans have the same thing for tequila. Well, the Americans have said, you know what, maybe we don't need that. Well, the Mexicans have said, well, if you take away that for tequila, what about bourbon? What about Tennessee whiskey? What about Canadian whiskey? You know, you guys make some great Canadian whiskey out in Alberta. Well, what about Canadian whiskey made in Montana? That could be a reality. Tequila made in Ohio, bourbon made in Tijuana. So the Mexicans are pushing back, but I think there will be a lot of pushback from Americans. The Americans actually have it written into law on what constitutes bourbon. So it'd be tough for them to say, no, we can make tequila in Ohio. It's not a problem. It's just the latest sticking point. But hey, this is what negotiations are all about. Each side's trying to get the best deal for their people. except this one, to me, could really hurt the Americans. So I think big name Republicans like Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, two Republican senators, are going to be calling up Donald Trump and saying, tell your trade advisor to step back there.
Always enlightening. Our Ottawa correspondent, Brian Lilley, joining me today. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you.